Morning. Today we'll be talking about Renaissance or the early modern criticism in the literary criticism period. Now, Renaissance falls between 16th to mid 18th century, and before this we had the medieval criticism, and that comprised of how the fall of Roman Empire and eventually how Aristotle came back to surface with Arabic translations and with Arabic translations from Latin and further into English. Now, Renaissance is a result of everything that happened in the medieval era. Now, the medieval era, starting from the 5th century to the 15th century, is marked by the death of Aristotle in the beginning to the revival of Aristotle after almost 1,000 years. Now, let us understand that how Renaissance became a necessity. It was kind of an aftermath of whatever happened in the medieval period. Going back to the medieval period again, we see how there is a schism between Christian theology and the biblical ideas versus the idea of humanism, versus the idea of knowledge, scholastic, scholasticism, and how the monks and the scholars were kind of in at odds with the biblical theories and theological system. Now, this schism basically gave birth to Renaissance, the importance of human as the center of the universe. So Renaissance would become the early modern criticism or the early modern period. Factors which contributed to this particular political timeline or this particular way of putting things across during the Renaissance, of which the first political timeline that we should understand is that the humanist scholars, they shaped the intellectual landscape throughout the early modern period. Political philosophers such as Niccolo Machiavelli, Thomas More, they revived the ideas of Greek and Roman thinkers and applied them in critiques of contemporary government. Pico della Mirandola wrote the Manifesto of Renaissance, so this is important, by the name of The Oration on the Dignity of Man. It is a vibrant defense of thinking. Then we have Matteo Palmieri, who's another humanist and is most known for his work Della Vita Civile, or On the Civic Life, which was printed in 1528, and it advocated civic humanism and for his influence in refining the Tuscan vernacular to the same level as Latin. So the importance of vernacular is again a part of the political timeline of the Renaissance. Then we have Palmieri, who drew on Roman philosophers and theorists, especially Cicero, who, like Palmieri, lived an active public life as a citizen and official, as well as a theorist and philosopher, and also Quintilian. So we have these people, these important political figures, as well as philosophers, who are trying to strike a balance, just like Francis Bacon would. In terms of their philosophy and theories related to political governance. So we have humanist scholars and we have political philosophers at the same time. Now, to understand the artistic timeline, let us first see how Renaissance is directly related to everything about art. So Renaissance, as we know, is a 14th century philosophy which also refers to rebirth or rediscovery of values, ethics of classical Greece and Rome. Now, by Italian humanists from Cicero to the artists and humanists in the 16th to 17th and 18th centuries, we have these figures trying to bring back the classical Greek and Roman ethics. Now there is everything has overturned, the medieval theological worldview has overturned, and the center that the human takes, that the human becomes, is more than divine. Its human achievements are important. There is importance on liberal arts, which is also humanists. The teachers of humanities become very important during this time, and there is a swift change from otherworldliness to this worldliness. So, theology, Christianity, biblical references are at the background. At the same time, artistic values, importance of human at the center takes the center stage. Now, considering the artistic timeline, we must understand that Renaissance is revival. So, the development of perspective was part of a wider trend towards realism in the arts. So there is realism in the arts, there is representation of reality more than anything supernatural. Painters developed other techniques by studying light, shadow, and famously in the case of Leonardo da Vinci, he studied the human anatomy. Underlying these changes in artistic method was a renewed desire to depict the beauty of nature and to unravel the axioms of aesthetics. So, importance of aesthetics again related to art, and this came up with the works of Leonardo, Michelangelo, Raphael, representing artistic pinnacles that were much imitated by other artists. There are other notable artists which include Sandro Botticelli, working for the Medici in Florence, Donatello, another Florentine, Titian in Venice, among others. Now, since there's a decline in feudalism right before this, there was a rise in rich middle class. So these rich middle class were who? They were people in the center of the main cities like Paris, London, Antwerp, and they became the patrons. So patrons, the most famous patron during this time was the Medici ruler of Florence, who had a secular philosophy, and the importance of vernacular and language along with Latin took place during the same time. So all of this, considering political timelines, artistic timelines, we have the birth of Renaissance as an aftermath. Talking of the historical timeline again, this is important in context to what was going on in terms of history, in terms of discoveries, in terms of reformations during that time. So let us quickly go through this. The discovery in 1492 of the New World by Christopher Columbus challenged the classical worldview. So people are moving out of their geographical boundaries, and this became an important aspect of seeing the Renaissance or the rebirth, as there is discovery of the New World by Columbus in 92. The words of Ptolemy in geography and Galen in medicine were found to not always match everyday observations. As the Protestant Reformation and Counter-Reformation clashed, the Northern Renaissance showed a decisive shift in focus from Aristotelian natural philosophy to chemistry and biological sciences like botany, anatomy, and medicine. Now, this is important because see how even Christianity started having its own bifurcations, and how Renaissance eventually even shift from Aristotelian natural philosophy to sciences, in particular sciences that studied botany, anatomy, and medicine. There is a willingness to question previously held truths and search for new answers, which resulted in a period of major scientific advancements. The scientific method, which focused on empirical evidence, of course, we have Bacon, Francis Bacon, who's been credited for this, and the importance of mathematics while discarding Aristotelian science. So, what started in medieval era as the rediscovery, towards the end of the medieval era, as the rediscovery of Aristotelian concepts, eventually was discarded in the Renaissance period, and there came the birth of proper study of sciences, philosophy, and chemistry and biological science. So the early and the most influential proponents of these ideas included Copernicus, Galileo, and Francis Bacon. So there is a new scientific method which led to great contributions in the fields of astronomy, physics, biology, and anatomy. So this becomes a historical timeline. We've gone through the political timeline as well as the artistic timeline. The historical timeline becomes very important again because it forms the foundation of how the literary theory and criticism developed over these ideas as the foundation. So now we come to the religious timeline. Now religious timeline, why we are studying it, we'll understand as we proceed how Renaissance was eventually a aftermath of how religion affected the people during that time. So the religious timeline says that the Renaissance had a profound effect on contemporary theology, particularly in the way people perceived the relationship between man and God. Like I said, there was a schism in the medieval era itself between Christian theology and the monasticism and the scholasticism, and how people perceive their relationships between man and God. So many of the period's foremost theologians were Sir Thomas More, who professed a religion of simple piety based on model of Christ in his work Thomas A Kempis, The Imitation of Christ. We have Ignatius of Loyola, who is inspired by More's work and formed the Society of Jesuits, which is the Society of Jesus. Then we have Martin Luther King, who advocated return to actual doctrines of scriptures and writings of church fathers such as Augustine, initiated the Reformation in 1517. He wrote 95 theses against indulgences and pinned them to the door in Wittenberg, rejecting the Roman Catholic notion of supremacy of church. Then we have Ulrich Zwingli, who incited the Protestant Revolution in Switzerland, advocated the elimination of many elements of the Catholic faith, like the Lent controversy of fasting, where he said there are no general valid rules on food that can be derived from the Bible. Again, a schism between what the Bible says and what the theologians profess. Then there's John Calvin, who strongly affirmed that Augustine's doctrine of predestination in his work, The Treatise on Eternal Predestination. This is very important again, Calvin. Max Weber argued the influence of Calvin's worldview and the Protestant ethic, which could be used to sanction the worldly activities of trading and the rise of capitalism. Lastly, we have the Catholic Reformation as an aftermath, in which Catholics redefined the doctrines at the Council of Trent, which resulted in schisms in the Christian world, where northern Germany and Scandinavia became Lutheran after Martin Luther, and England adopted Catholic doctrine with allegiance to the English crown. So this is the religious timeline, how people and their belief systems changed as a result of Renaissance. Let us understand the word Renaissance. It literally began in 1498, which is the close end of the 15th century. It refers to rebirth or rediscovery of values, ethics, styles of classical Greece and Rome, which were devised by Italian humanists. It overturned the medieval theological worldview and replaced it with a more secular vision. Its values were centered around human rather than divine, focusing on human potential. The term retained its Ciceronian connection with the liberal arts, the definition of a humanist being a teacher of humanities. It encompassed a time of boom in manufacture, focus on economic life, expansion of trade and commerce in emerging cities like Florence, Milan, Venice, and Rome, the center of capitalism. There is decline of feudalism and rise of a powerful and rich middle class. A new civic consciousness of patriotism, pursuit of economic and political interests took place. So now we have the Renaissance Humanism, which is the topic of our discussion in case of critical theories or literary theories. Now, humanism, as we said, was the development of secular and political philosophy. The patrons of art, such as the Medici rulers of Florence, were increasingly secular rather than ecclesiastical. Now, there are figures, the humanist figures that we talk of, and the first of them is Desiderius Erasmus, who is a Dutch man. He is the first renowned humanist thinker with convictions in reason, naturalism, tolerance, and inherent goodness of man. Now, his work, Colloquia, which was written in 1519, is a critical abuse of the Catholic Church, and he paved a way for a Lutheran Reformation in a way through his work Colloquia. Now, his second work, Encomium Moriae, which means the praise of folly, which was written in 1509, talks about the gullibility, or in a way you can say that he talks about the gullibility of masses in terms of theological dogmatism, how the masses are blinded by the ideas of theological dogmatisms or dogmas. Then we have second humanist figure called Francois Rabelais, who's a French guy, and his Gargantua and Pantagruel is expounding a naturalistic and philosophical philosophy, ridiculing scholastic theology. Sir Thomas More, in England, whose Utopia, written in 1516, was a veiled condemnation of the social and economic defects of that time. Lastly, we have Francis Bacon, who's from Britain, and is a forerunner of empiricist tradition in Britain, urged the use of inductive method and direct observation against the reliance upon authority, faith, and deductive reasoning. So these are Renaissance humanists, and now Renaissance and the literary criticism, which is our topic of discussion here, after the brief background that I've just given you. So first, Renaissance literary criticism actually was forged in the struggle to defend poetry and literature from the charges brought by clerical circles. Again, the schism between theology and scholasticism. Renaissance writers added the doctrine of the unities of time and place to Aristotle's original demand for unity of action. So again, this becomes important because most of us assume that Aristotle gave us the three unities of time, place, and action, while it was the Renaissance writers who added the two doctrines of time and place to Aristotle's original demand for unity of action. The first Renaissance, the first most important figure in the Renaissance literary criticism is Sir Philip Sidney, and his seminal text of literary criticism, which is Apology for Poetry, written between 1580 to 81, represents the synthesis of Aristotle, Horace, Boccaccio, and Julius Scaliger. Again, this is a result of Renaissance ideas to defend poetry and literature from the charges brought by the clerical circles. Now, his work is a defense of poetry against the attack on poetry by a Puritan minister, Stephen Gosson, in his work The School of Abuse, written in 1579. His initial argument in this text is that poetry was the first form in which knowledge was expressed. Historiographers and philosophers too use the passport to poetry to enter the popular gates of judgment. His second argument is from tradition, where he says that the Roman term for poet was vates, which means diviner or foreseer, and Greek for poet was poien, which means to make. He, through the above, meant that the poet, in making things either better than nature, brings forth a new forms such as never were in nature. His making is superior to nature. Lastly, he says that nature never set forth the earth in so rich tapestry as diverse poets have done. Her world is brazen, the poets only deliver a golden. Now this becomes a seminal text in terms of Renaissance literary criticism, because this becomes the beginning of defense of poetry, written by Sir Philip Sidney as Apology for Poetry, against the attack on poetry by a Puritan minister, Stephen Gosson, in his work The School of Abuse. Next we have second nature as a concept by Sir Philip Sidney, where he talks of an intrinsic connection between man's ability to make poetry and his status in relation to God. That man is the image of God, is what he says. He implies that man is elevated above the world of physical nature, called second nature. This godlike activity of man is expressed in poetry through his wit, which is a glimpse of perfection. So again, the importance of wit, the importance of man, and man as the image of God, and the whole process of creation of poetry, which is almost, he refers to as the man's ability to make poetry, and his relation and his status in relation to God becomes his second nature. Then he gives the term three kinds of poetic imitation, wherein he draws from Horace and Aristotle and adds the third kind, which is the imitation free of the constraints imposed by Aristotle. Like I said, Aristotle's philosophies, Aristotle's theories eventually overturned, and this was the beginning of it, where he says that the poet is free of dependence on nature, not restricted by subject matter on which Aristotle focused. His imitation does not produce anything in nature, since his concern is with portrayals of probability and idealized situations. He says that the poet imitates in order to delight and teach. So, the poet's chief competitors, he says, are philosophers and historians, wherein former, the philosopher, will claim path to virtue to teach, and the latter will teach through concrete examples of virtue based on experience. Then he gives the term peerless poet, wherein he says that a peerless poet is the one who follows both functions. He says, I quote, he coupleth the general notions with particular examples. Lastly, poet is the food for tenderest stomachs. He is the right philosopher. Poetry is more philosophical and serious than history. So this is Sir Philip Sidney on various aspects of poetry, on various aspects in his work, An Apology for Poetry. And then we have Sir Philip Sidney talking of the function of poetry being threefold. First, to teach virtue. Second, to move people to virtuous action. And third, to tell them of the transitory nature of worldly affairs. He considers heroic poetry to be the best and most accomplished. He is against other kinds of knowledge more fruitful than poetry. He believes that the greatest gifts upon humans are oratio, which is speech, and ratio, which is reason. He says that poetry polishes the gift of speech and has an affinity with knowledge. Moreover, when it teaches and moves to virtue, then there can be no more fruitful knowledge than poetry. He is against the accusation that poetry is the mother of all lies, to which he responds saying, he, the poet, has nothing affirmed and therefore never lieth. He is against the idea that Plato banished poets from his ideal republic, because he believes that Plato opposed the abuse of poetry rather than the art itself. He charged the poets of promoting false opinions of gods amongst the youth, and he ends his text with a lamentation over the impoverished state to which poetry has been declined to in England. He curses those who are possessed of so earth-creeping a mind that it cannot lift itself up to look to the sky of poetry. Lastly, the metaphor he encapsulates the text wherein he says that poetry is elevated to that sacred status where it is opposed to the worldliness and earth-creeping concerns which are the newly appointed heaven of human inventions. Talking about the poetic form and rhetoric, there is the scope of poetics broadened beyond the constraints of rhetoric to encompass moral philosophy, metaphysics, science and political thought. Now the Renaissance poets rejected the regular stress-based alliterative meter of medieval poets. They rejected rhyme as an unclassical barbarism. So in that context, the first work we have is of Samuel Daniel in defense of rhyme, written in 1603. Then we have Thomas Campion, who rejected rhyme in favor of classical forms. And therein came the words blank verse, which is a new metrical basis for English poetry, which was the result of aversion to rhyme by figures such as William Webb and George Puttenham. Then we have Marco Girolama's Vidas, The Art of Poetry, written in 1527, which had insights from Horatian and rhetorical treatment of invention and style. We have Julius Caesar Scaliger's 7 Book of Poetics, written in 1561, which elaborated an influential account of literary criticism. Now we have George Puttenham, based on the revival of the form and rhetoric. He's talking about in his work The Art of English Poesy, written in 1589, which is based on rhetorical analysis of style, which is divided into 3 books. First, Justifying Poetry. He expresses needs of individual and society. Second, title of Proportion, devoted to craft of poetry. Third, of Ornament, offering a renaming of the figures and tropes of classical rhetoric. Then he talks of the central purpose of his treatise, which is to justify the use of the vernacular language for poetry. He gives us terms such as odes, lyrics, epigrammatists, which were partly brought by him into the standard currency through his text. So we have George Puttenham to be credited for words like ode, lyrics and epigrammatist in his work Art of English Poesy. Then there's a term called inkhorn, which in his chapter of language he talks of the extent to which Latin and Greek words could be imported into English through the ongoing controversy in 1540s of inkhorn. He gave the 3 principal styles. He says that a man's style should confront his subject matter, and the 3 styles are high, embraces hymns, tragedies and histories. He means that the middle, as in comedy, deals with the business of ordinary men, and low, as in eclogue and pastoral, deals with the commoners and craftsmen. So he's giving us ideas of how rhetorical analysis of style of writing poetry is divided into all his 3 books. And his 3 books are Of Ornament and further of proportion as well. And he's given us the main terms like inkhorn term and three principal styles in which he talks about high, embracing hymns, tragedies and histories. Second figure we have in terms of rhyme and the form is poet and dramatist George Gascoigne, who is credited with having written the first literary classical essay. His work is called Certain Notes of Instruction Concerning the Making of Verse or Rhyme in English. The essay appeared in a collection of his work titled The Posies of George Gascoigne. The above collection contained Jocasta, the second earliest English tragedy written in blank verse. In the essay, he cautions against use of rhyme without reason, wherein he says that the poet should not get distracted by searching rhyme to guide the matter of the poem. Poet should avoid words of many syllables, since the most ancient words are of one syllable, so that the more monosyllables you use, the truer Englishman you shall seem, and the less you smell of inkhorn. Again, going back to George Puttenham. His essay is in the tradition of Horace's Ars Poetica and is a treatise offering advice to aspiring poets. So we have George Gascoigne here. Next we talk of Neoclassical Criticism, and this emerged in the early 17th century, which is a reference to a tendency in literature and art which comprised of a return to classical models, literary styles, and values of ancient Greek and Roman authors. Neoclassical writers reaffirmed literary compositions as rational and rule-bound process requiring craft, labor, and study. They insist on separation of poetry and prose, purity of each genre, and hierarchy of genres placed epic above tragedy. Now the verse form was Alexandrian in France and heroic couplet in England. They believed in human finitude, unlike later romantics, that there is infinite possibilities in truth while human is limited. Central concepts of imitation and nature, imitation of classical models of Homer and Virgil, and concept of nature refer to hierarchical order of universe. Regarding invention, La Bruyere taught that the ancients had already expressed everything that was worth saying. So now this is a return to the old classical systems, hence it is named the Neoclassical Criticism, and it emerged in the early 17th century, very close to the birth of Renaissance. Now its main figures basically talked about a separation of poetry and prose. They talked about how literary composition was a rational process. They talked about how there's a need to return to the ancient Greek and Roman authors for their literary styles and models. There was a verse form in France which was called Alexandrian, and in England it was heroic couplet. Now again they believed in the concept of imitation and nature, obviously deriving from the classical models of Homer, Virgil, and the concept of nature they refer to the hierarchical order of universe. And they believed that everything that the ancients had already expressed was it. There was no further need to delve on it any further. This is Neoclassical Criticism. Then we are talking about French Neoclassicism, and in which Neoclassicism first took root in France by Jean Chapelain, who introduced ideas of Italian Aristotelian commentators Castelvetro and Scaliger. Louis XIV, first of the Bourbon kings who exercised absolute monarchy, believed he was appointed by God, and this also is an important aspect of French Neoclassicism. His court was the center of patronage of numerous poets and dramatists. There was a growth of educated elites which proved ripe for the founding of the French Academy, Academia Francaise in 1635, with a mission to standardize language to creation of dictionary and grammar. So again we have birth of dictionary and birth of grammar. Writers such as Francois de Malherbe argued that meaning should be stabilized in interests of linguistic clarity and communications, and hence the birth of dictionary. We have Frdric Cornell, who is primarily a playwright and was a major influence of French Neoclassicism. Frdric Cornell is the first person you can refer in terms of French revival of Neoclassicist literature. His work, Three Discourse on Dramatic Poetry, written in 1660, is a response to controversy arising from his own dramatic practice in the play Les Cid, written in 1637, which was attacked not only by the critics but by French literary and political figures. The play's alleged failure was that it observed the rules of classical theatre it did not observe the rules of classical theatre of action, time and play. Cornell gave the third discourse entitled Of the Three Unities of Action, Time and Play, in which regarding the unity of action he says, it meant that tragedy should only show one action on the stage. He says that separate actions find their conclusion in principal action. Each subordinate action can become complete only through several other actions. Secondly, he talks about unity of time, in which he meant that the action of a tragedy must be encompassed within one revolution of sun. To this he says that allowing an action to extend up to 30 hours duration, since some subjects do not deserve a brief treatment. So he's trying to negotiate between what was advised, what was an aftermath of Aristotelian unity of time. Then he talks about unity of place, in which he says that there is no such rule prescribed by Aristotle, as it was a product of consequence of unity of one day, and this rule, he says, it puts constraints on the playwright's endeavor. We have Nicholas Boileau. His timeline is 1636 to 1711. He was a French poet and a satirist, and influenced English and German poets and critics as well. His work, The Art of Poetry or Les Arts Poétiques, written in 1674, was translated into English by John Dryden. His text is a formal statement of the principles of French Classicism. Written as a poem in the tradition of Horace's Ars Poetica, it offers advice to the poet in various genres of tragedy, comedy, epic, and ode. He appeals to nature to study nature, be your only care, he says. For actors, he says, quote, must by reason be controlled, let young men speak like young, old men like old, unquote. He means each person must be portrayed in his proper character. Poet must observe exact decorum, he says, which means it should rest on the knowledge of human nature. A poet must not only know about human nature, must also be an observer of various customs of ages. He must observe the town and study well the court. We have John Dryden, England, 1631 to 1700. He is a major influence in England, and his influence in return comes from France. So French influence in England intensified by the restoration of 1660 of Charles II, who was exiled in France after the English Civil War and returned to the court of Boileau's Art Poetique. Now Dryden translated Boileau's work and occupied a seminal place in English critical history. His work, Essay on Dramatic Poesy, written in 1668, to which Samuel Johnson said, modern English prose begins here, makes Dryden a very important figure of the French influence of Neoclassists. Written as a debate on drama conducted by 4 speakers, each of whom had the following argument, starting with Crites, whose name means judge in Greek. It was actually a representation of Robert Howard, who is Dryden's brother-in-law. The essay was written as a result of dispute with Howard over rhyme in drama, where he said that rhyme is unnatural in a play and favored blank verse. Crites notes that poetry is now held in lower esteem and arguments that ancients were faithful imitators and wise observers of nature. He reminds others of all the rules of drama formulated by Aristotle and says, we quote, we have added nothing of our own except we have the confidence to say that our wit is better, unquote. For unity of action, he says, all other things in the play are to be subservient. That means anything that is of prime importance in poetry or in play is the unity of action. The second character who walks in after Crites is Lycidius, who is a direct copy or who's a representation of Charles Sedley, who offers the following definitions of play. Quote, a just and lively image of human nature, representing its passions and humors and the charges of fortune to which it is subject, for the light and instruction of mankind, unquote. The definition of drama embodies a divergence from the classical models in favor of modern drama. He extols the virtues of French and drama as they provide a variety of emotion and have dialogue, action and narration, all in proportion, unlike the English stage. Now, the third character who walks in this particular text is Eugenius, whose name means well-born, and it might be a representation of Charles Sackville, who was Lord Buckhurst, a patron of Dryden and a poet himself. He is the first to defend moderns, saying that they have not restricted themselves to dull imitations. Going against Crites, he says, we have collective experience and wisdom of ancients to draw upon, and it does not end there. For unities, he says that ancients used a worn-out plot derived from Thebes or Troy, that they fell short of instructing and delighting, violating the unities themselves. So this is Eugenius, who's kind of diverging from Crites' outlook. We have Meander, who is the new man, and it is Dryden talking himself, wherein he says he does not refute the claims made by Lycidius, but he says that the very faults of the English are actually its virtues that take English drama beyond the pale of classical heritage. He points, I quote, the beauties of French drama are the beauties of statue, but not of man, unquote, because it is not animated with the soul of poesy, which is imitation of humor and passions. Justifying the genre of tragic comedy, he says that the contrast between mirth and compassion will throw important scenes into sharper relief. He takes a brief assessment of Shakespeare by saying, I quote, he had the largest and most comprehensive soul. This is important. This is Dryden commenting on Shakespeare, and he says he was naturally learned by reading of nature and all her images. Then we have Ben Jonson, whom he regards as the most learned and judicious writer which theatre ever had, and his gift was representation of humour. He concludes that Shakespeare was the Homer, or the father of our dramatic poets, and Jonson was the Virgil, again a reference to classical writers. His final debate against Crites was that in everyday life people do not speak in blank verse any more than they do in rhyme. Again, the importance of rhyme resurfaced for Dryden. Next we have Alexander Pope, 1688 to 1744. Now Pope's year of birth coincides with the Glorious Revolution, where England's Catholic monarch was displaced by Protestant King William III of Orange, and prevailing anti-Catholic laws constrained many areas of Pope's life. Pope's greatest work is an essay on criticism written in 1711, wherein it is a statement of neoclassical principles which had its roots in the rhetorical tradition of Aristotle and modernity of Bacon and Locke. He cautions the poets to make the best critics, and best poetry and criticism are divinely inspired. Pope sees the endeavor of criticism as a noble one, and he calls for critic to base his interpretation on author's intention. Focus on the author's intention is what Pope asks for. His guidelines are to recognize the overall unity of a work and moral sensibility of a critic. Now, criticism here is taking a shape through Pope's words, and he warns, I quote, truth should be accompanied by good breeding and not mere bookish knowledge. He says that the critics degenerated into irrational attacks on poets as a consequence of their own failure to master the poetic art. I quote, he says, those who could not win the mistress wooed the maid. So, he talks about critics in this reference. Then he wrote an essay on man wherein he expounds the great chain of being, wherein he's talking about a hierarchy in which we live as human beings, and he says that ranging from God and angels through humans and the lower animals to plants and inanimate objects. He's talking about how man is placed in the hierarchy of great chain of being. Next we have Aproven, 1640 to 1689. She is one of the founders of English novel and the first woman to do so. Her first novel, Oronoco, written in 1688, is the first to oppose slavery, inspired by her stay in Suriname. Her controversial views about drama, expressed as prefaces to her plays, brought the first kind of female authorship issues. In her work Epistle to the Reader, which prefaces, in her work The Dutch Lover, which which has a preface by the name of Epistle to the Reader, she strikes a tone of defiance and defends value of drama by contrasting it favorably with traditional learning which is taught in universities. So she's kind of pro traditional learning, and she says she's kind of pro modern learning, and she defends the value of drama. She says how important drama is, and she kind of negates the traditional learning which has been taught in the universities. She denies that dramatic poets can be charged with too great reformation of men's minds, as it's unrealistic to expect drama to perform moral function, as the most assiduous disciples of the stage are the most foolish and lewd group of people in the city. Now, when she was charged for displaying plays or projecting characters beyond human life, she said that the charge was regarding men's mind and not for drama to perform a moral function. She quotes saying that her most assiduous, her most regular disciples in the stage, in the play, in the theatre are the most foolish and the lewd group of people in the city. On female authorship, she says that women, if given the same education as men, are just as capable of acquiring knowledge as men, as successful plays do not rest on learning. She gives the example of Shakespeare and Johnson. She dismissed the traditional rules of drama as musty rules of unity. And she concludes, I quote, "All I ask is the privilege for my masculine part, the poet in me." Next we have Samuel Johnson, 1709 to 1784. His biography was recorded by his friend James Boswell in his work Life of Samuel Johnson, written in 1791. Johnson's work, preface to an edition of Shakespeare's plays, established Shakespeare's reputation. His debate on relative virtues of ancient and modern writers is a part of this preface. Shakespeare, called by him as the poet of nature, leads up to his readers, a faithful mirror of manners and of life. That's what Johnson thinks of Shakespeare. He defends Shakespeare against charges by critics as Rhymer and Voltaire, who claimed that his characters insufficiently reflected their time and status. Johnson retorts that he always makes nature predominant over accident, and he preserves the essential character. In his defense of tragic comedy, he appeals to the nature as a higher authority than precedent. A mixed genre makes for a greater variety. He quotes, "All pleasure consists in variety." Then his work, The History of Rosellas, written to pay for his mother's funeral, has insights on nature of poetry through Imlac, a character. Poetry was considered as the highest learning, ancient poets the best. He says that the rules of unity, especially unity in character, should be the first endeavor of a writer to distinguish nature from custom. Lastly, his work Lives of English Poets, 1781, which have 52 prefaces of English poets like Dryden, named him the father of English criticism. He said, I quote, "He founded brick and he left it marble," on the influence in poetry, and he's talking in reference to Dryden. For Pope, he said, "If Pope be not poet, there is poetry to be found." This is a very important quote by Johnson, and he saw Addison's prose as the model of the middle style. So this is Samuel Johnson. We come to an end of Renaissance. Now, starting from Philip Sidney talking in the Apology for Poetry, we have observed how the defense of poetry leading to a defense of drama, and eventually how French neoclassicists and writers such as Aproven and Samuel Johnson are trying to revive criticism in a way, or are trying to establish criticism in a way that paves way for future. And this future will be what? This future will be the future which talks about enlightenment. Next, we'll have enlightenment lined up. Thank you for watching.